Excellent. Well, I think we now have been joined by those who are listening in this morning. Good morning to all of you, and good evening to Susan Sell from Australia, and to Percy Haki Maranma, who are two speakers this morning. And we're going to be joined, I think, in due course by Daniele Akabuji as well. We think there may be a slight timing issue. This is the third panel in the course of the conference, which FIIA is very kindly sponsoring and has been taking the lead in organizing. In the first two sessions, we've heard some very, very interesting contributions, mainly exploring problems and challenges. We've heard about the extent of geoeconomics being, one might say, weaponized as a means of achieving both competitive advantage, national competitive advantage, and also as a means of engaging in geopolitics by other means. And we've heard in particular about the very great importance now of big data and the AI technologies that go with it, and the extent to which those two have been increasingly a source of competition and rivalry between China and the US in particular, but also between China and the West, and indeed, of course, between other countries as well. And the extent of the problem is therefore very clear. That there's been a huge shift away from an open trading world and the assumptions of the previous decades, and into a situation of global rivalry in which economics and technology are at the center of an increasingly strained set of relationships. What we haven't yet heard much about is solutions to this problem, and the current dreadful circumstances in Ukraine reminds us of the desperate need for humanity, that we should find some set of solutions that enable us to maintain a peaceful world in which national boundaries and integrities are preserved despite these rivalries. And of course, that heavily depends on having a system of governance, global governance, that can help to resolve these issues as they arise. We heard yesterday from a former Prime Minister of Finland about the likelihood that the current rules-based international order is inadequate to the task of dealing with these new kinds of rivalry. And in this session, I hope we're going to hear some positive suggestions about how to improve on these matters by addressing the future of multilateral economic governance. And I'm going to start by asking Susan Sell to make a presentation on that subject, and then we'll move on from there. Susan, over to you.
Just one moment, I'm pulling up my slides again. All right, there we go. Sorry about that. First of all, I just want to thank the organizers for including me in this really interesting and important conference. Can everyone see the slides?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. So what I'm going to talk about is the future of multilateral governance, economic governance. My background is really looking at trade, development, intellectual property protection, the politics around intellectual property protection, and global governance more broadly. So that's the kind of thing I work on in political economy. So that's what I'll be talking about today. So to start out, I just want to give you an overview of what I'm going to talk about. I'll give a brief introduction. I'll talk about trade in the World Trade Organization. That's the multilateral economic institution that I'll be focusing on most. I'll talk about success and fragmentation in the trade regime, the China paradox, which is a phrase from Kristen Hopewell, who has a really good book out on China right now and the U.S.-China rivalry. Mistaken assumptions that we make, the fact that there are many Chinas, and then the way forward, which is the thing I have the least about in terms of solutions, but I hope that at least I can talk about a range of maybe steps forward. So to start with introducing this topic, we've seen, of course, a profound change over time, and one you've heard about in the last day at this conference. As you know, at the moment, multilateral trade governance is pretty much moribund with the death of the Doha round and failed efforts even after the Doha round to try and jumpstart with just single negotiations over agriculture subsidies and fishery subsidies. So the multilateral trade governance is just not happening. There's no rulemaking going on at the moment. The U.S. can no longer make the rules, and that's something the U.S. is trying to grapple with. It's been struggling with that for a while before China even became so dominant. And I think also simplistic narratives about China are really unhelpful. This binary way of thinking about it, are they a peaceful partner, the peaceful rise of China, or are they a disruptive threat? They're both of those things. And I just think these binaries are very unhelpful in ways of thinking about the problems and also thinking about the solutions. So in terms of trade in the World Trade Organization, there's stories we tell ourselves about trade that really aren't very accurate. And I'm an American, so I'm coming at it from that perspective. And because America did write most of the global rules that everyone else had to follow if they wanted to be part of the Western trade regime after World War II. One of the stories we tell ourselves is that the United States has exercised what is referred to as benign hegemony, that we tied ourselves to a rules-based order in order to help others, that we were benign, not coercive hegemons, and that this was a way that everybody could improve their situations. We also tell ourselves that incorporating potential rivals into the regime is the answer. And the fact China has benefited handsomely from the rules-based order. They have really benefited in joining the WTO. And their economic rise is in large part because of their involvement in the World Trade Organization and access to the trade regime. Another story we tell ourselves is that China will support the system that they have benefited from so richly. And in many ways, they do support the system. They support the trade system and most of the rules, but I'll talk about ones they don't support. Another story we tell ourselves says that interdependence bolsters cooperation, that the more intertwined we become, the more we will have a stake in the well-being of our partners. And as you've heard about the last few days, and I'll mention a bit, weaponized interdependence seems to be the new approach to interdependence. So interdependence does not make conflict go away. Another story we tell ourselves, at least in the United States, or some commentators say, don't worry about the rise of China. The US was all worried about Japan in the 1980s, that they were going to be the hegemon, economic hegemon. And so China is just Japan 2.0, and we'll all look back and say, oh, that's, we shouldn't have made such a fuss. In fact, there's a huge difference between Japan and China. Japan is dependent on the United States for security guarantees. China is not. And so that's a huge difference between these. So none of these are very common stories you hear about China in punditry in the United States, and most of these things are just stories and they're not accurate. What we've seen in the trade regime in particular is we've seen success and fragmentation. In many ways, you can think of the GATT and now the WTO as dizzy with success. After the World War II, each round of the trade negotiations led to more and more and more reopening the world economy in a multilateral system. It led to the dramatic reduction of barriers to entry at different countries. It led to the dramatic reduction of tariffs. And so in the way the trade regime was dizzy with success, it tackled the easy things, the at the border measures, the transparent things. Where things started to get more complicated, and I would argue was sort of the beginning of a very complicated trade regime, was the Uruguay round of trade negotiations that went on from 1985 to 1994. And that led to the establishment of the WTO. But what the Uruguay round brought was deep integration, deep economic integration, and it reached very deep into countries' domestic regulatory regimes. So the trade regime was getting into everybody's business in a way that it had not before. And this is bound to create trouble and conflict because that means states have to rejigger their domestic regulatory bargains in order to stay compliant with the trade rules. And some of these were very, very tough. The three big issues that were brought into the trade regime in the Uruguay round were quite problematic for the most of the world. That was intellectual property protection, that was investment, the agreement on investment, and then services, general trade and services, the GATS agreement. Now this, the intellectual property protection, which is what I've done the most work on, that was the most controversial, the most problematic, I would argue, and that's where we really started to see pushback on the trade rules. What it led to, these three issue areas that had been lobbied for very hard by multinational corporations that owned IP, that were big investors, and service providers like banks, they lobbied very hard. They wanted these in the trade regime. They hadn't been before. These were new disciplines. What these led to were massive resource transfers from the global south to the global north, especially around intellectual property protection and royalties in particular, where the transfers from south to north were bigger than the whole foreign aid budgets that were going north to south. So this was really problematic from an equity standpoint, and it was not in most countries' interest to adopt stringent rules around intellectual property. And this became very obvious quickly with the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And then we had quite a bit of activism and organization among civil society, but developing countries, where they were experiencing millions of unnecessary death because of lack of access to antiretrovirals, which were patented and very expensive and not available. So this put intellectual property on everybody's radar who hadn't really thought about it before. Some countries weren't really sure exactly what they were signing up for at the time. But at any rate, this led to real pushback against the trade regime around this issue in particular, which has not gone away. We see the same problems arising with COVID. For all sorts of things, because patents exclude other people from using that technology or using that know-how, and that creates scarcity. And scarcity is not what you want of medical equipment, protective equipment, vaccines, and therapeutics. You do not want shortages. You don't want scarcity in a global pandemic. So at any rate, what this started to do with introducing these different disciplines with services, with intellectual property, with investment, it created a lot of regime complexity. And that means that multiple institutions were responsible for looking after these issues. So intellectual property was defined as a trade issue by those who wanted it in the trade regime. But with HIV/AIDS, it became redefined as a health issue, a public health issue. And in that case, and there were all sorts of bad behavior. 39 pharmaceutical firms sued Nelson Mandela, who was just trying to get rid of medical apartheid in South Africa to make sure that his people could get affordable HIV/AIDS drugs. And it was a bad look. But what that led to was mobilization and coalition building to take intellectual property issues into the World Health Organization. It also came up in the Food and Agriculture Organization because they were pushing for patents or patent-like protection of seeds. And so that Monsanto really wanted, for example. So at any rate, the spread of these issues led to regime complexity and much more institutional thickness. And what this led to was forum shopping and forum shifting. So different coalitions of actors started to engage in very strategic institutional behavior in order to try and foment changes that they wanted. For example, the coalition seeking access to medicines was able to get unanimity at the World Health Organization about the importance of relaxing patent rules to get access to medicines for health emergencies, and that later found its way back into the trade regime as the Doha Declaration on Access to Essential Medicines. So there's a lot of interesting strategic behavior, but and we also saw, and here's where the United States was not able to get what it wanted in multilateral form. So this is before the rise of big China. So the trade regime was getting fraught in many ways and challenged before the big rise of China. And so the United States knew it could not get what it wanted in the multilateral forum because the BRICS were pushing back, countries were pushing back on they didn't want any more intellectual property expansions because they saw what happened in HIV/AIDS. And so the United States started to engage in very strategic behavior, not only shifting horizontally as they did to get intellectual property in the World Trade Organization, they shifted from the World Intellectual Property Organization over to the GATT regime to get it embedded in the trade regime. But they also engaged in extensive vertical form shifting, whether it was unilateral threatening of countries under Section 301 of US trade law, threatening them with sanctions if they didn't protect their intellectual property. They engaged in plurilateral negotiations, which were efforts to create clubs of like-minded parties. And they engaged in, for example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations and the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement. So these are two plurilateral agreements which represented vertical form shifting. The US knew it couldn't make the rules it wanted at the multilateral level because they were getting pushback, so they moved down vertically to these plurilateral agreements. And because they knew their multilateral rulemaking capability was sharply reduced. But the plurilateral agreements were strategic in that they did not invite China in. And the thinking was if they could get enough countries up to 80% in the trade and TTIP with Europe, the TTIP, it was another plurilateral agreement, trade and investment agreement of some kind with Europe. All these were plurilateral. And the thinking was if we could get 80% of the world economy to agree the world that the US wants, especially around things like intellectual property, that was a huge factor in all these TPP, in ACTA, and came up in TTIP as well. If we could get the whole world, 80% of the world to agree, then China's going to have no option but to join the rules we want. So that was a US kind of end run around the WTO where they know there was going to be a stalemate. And these ended up not working out too well for a variety of reasons. I'd be happy to answer questions about that, but in the interest of time, I'm going to go forward. So before China, US was running into trouble. It wasn't able to get its way in the multilateral forum. So now the rulemaking at WTO is frozen. The Doha round, which was launched in 2001, is dead. And part of the reason that died had to do with trust issues. because in the Uruguay round, the US was asking developing countries to liberalize trade and services, protect intellectual property, and liberalize investment climates. And the promise was there would be a quid pro quo with rolling back agricultural subsidies that the North had, especially Europe, but also the United States, to increase market access for developing countries for their agriculture goods. Well, the US and EU did not make good on those promises. They did not roll back those subsidies. So there were some real trust issues. The developing countries had to invest a lot of resources to build institutional capacity around services, investment, and IP. But, you know, they were promised something, it wasn't delivered. And so over time, though, because the Doha round went on so long, it started in 2001, over time, when everyone is focused on the BRICS, that fell away with the rise of China and really became a story about US-China rivalry. So that is in more recent years, but Doha round was in trouble from very early on. Christian Hopewell talks about the China paradox. And on one hand, it's an economic powerhouse. It's the world's largest trader. It's the second largest economy. But on the other hand, it's actually a developing country. If you compare per capita GDP, in China, it's $8,000 per capita. In the United States, it's $57,000. So they have a long way to go in terms of development in raising per capita GDP. So it's this paradox. On one hand, it's a powerhouse. On the other hand, it's a developing country that's actually fairly poor. Many of the people there are fairly poor. But China is destabilizing trade governance. And there the argument is between reciprocity, which is universal liberalization, which is what US likes, versus special and differential treatment, which is when you get excused from some of the disciplines because you're a developing country. So you can protect certain sectors, or maybe you can provide subsidies for certain sectors because you have to, you need to develop first of all before you can really accept these universal reciprocal rules. So the Chinese insist that they should be offered special and differential treatment in the trade regime because it's a developing country. And US conflict over that issue killed the Doha round. The US walked away from the agreement because they were not happy with the carve-outs for China, granting it special and differential treatment. So the whole round just ended. Post-Doha, in the World Trade Organization, there have been two negotiations, one on agricultural subsidies and one on fishery subsidies. Now, but interestingly, in both of these areas, the market size of China really hurts the global South because of the structural power of their economy, the huge size of it. And it also causes catastrophic overfishing. China has the largest industrial fishing fleet in the world. So the old North-South subsidies argument, it doesn't really work anymore. That's not the flavor. So this subsidies problem that's been a big North-South problem with, as I mentioned before, EU and American agricultural subsidies. And Brazil won a case in the WTO over cotton for US subsidies of cotton. It used to be it was a North-South problem. The North was engaging in these subsidies that were hurting developing countries in agriculture. But now China's the world's biggest trader. It's also the largest supplier of agricultural and fisheries subsidies. It's also the largest provider of export credit, largest provider of export credit for coal-fired power plants. So the biggest subsidy villain, if you want to call it that, is China. And yeah, so this is a big change. So it's not a North-South issue. It's the developing countryside of China, that element of China, that is driving these big subsidies, not the economic powerhouse. So we have some mistaken assumptions. I'll go through quickly. The pure market, we talk about the market as an ideal type. These are not flat spaces or arenas where, exchange happens. These are arenas maybe in the old Roman sense of the gladiators. They really reflect there's a lot of power in markets and a lot of hierarchies, and they're not just neutral, flat opportunities for everybody. The state market dichotomy is also flawed, that it's states versus markets. States and markets are deeply intertwined. And in the case of China, it's not about states versus markets, it's about liberalism versus development. And the economic powerhouse China, in the sectors it's very strong in, is very pro-IP. It now has the biggest intellectual property office in the world, and it's very seriously committed. It's trained a ton of judges. IP is a big curriculum item in law schools there. They take it very seriously for things that they're competitive in. And they have good R&D capabilities in certain sectors, and they're serious about having their property protected. They want to be on the side of the table getting the royalties now, but they're willing to relax those standards, or they're told, they're accused of stealing intellectual property in sectors where they're still developing. So that dichotomy comes out in all sorts of different ways. Another mistaken assumption is that all countries, as they become modern, make sequential progress towards a market economy. And in the US, there's a big assumption that China's in the WTO now. It's going to become, open markets. It's going to be capitalist. It'll be democratic eventually. That's another problematic assumption. So the challenge of China to market conceptualizations is the continued resilience and even maybe strengthening of the authoritarian state-led capitalist economic model. It also has very interesting positioning, China does, around notions of power and fairness in the global economy. On the one hand, their subsidies are really hurting the global South in important ways. And on the other hand, when they do engage with the global South in terms of aid, they don't put conditions around it like the International Monetary Fund did with the US, saying, you have to cut your budget for schools, you have to cut heating oil budgets. They are saying, no, we're not going to interfere with your domestic sovereignty. We have a non-interference principle. There's no conditions. So that's appealing to many developing countries versus a more heavy-handed approach of the West and the US through the International Monetary Fund. So China has very mixed preferences about global markets. On one hand, they want policy space for development, and part of the agricultural subsidies is not just about development. They're looking through the lenses of US-China rivalry. They're very worried about food security. They bought up tons of acres and acres of agricultural land in Africa, and they also are subsidizing agriculture for domestic production because they're afraid with this rivalry, if the US cuts off agricultural exports to China, it won't be able to feed its population. So there are some complicated issues there, but they're mixed preferences. It's not one China. It's not one standard approach. So there's many Chinas. The vaccine example, I think, is a good one. I'm going to buzz through this because in the interest of time, but basically what do we learn from China with vaccines? They're very pragmatic. We have to look at China's political economy by sector. Some they're developing in, some they're very strong and competitive and robust. So their approaches to political economy are very different. And this difference across them might be an opportunity to not see this as a grand geopolitical competition, but try to find places where we really could connect and really can move forward on agreements that would help both parties. China's vaccine diplomacy was so interesting in COVID-19. It was a big contrast to the Western vaccine nationalism, where the West was hoarding all the vaccines that it could, even though a lot of the rest of the world had nothing. And we had more than we needed in some cases. So between 2020 and June 21, only China, India, and Russia were practicing vaccine diplomacy. We were hoarding it. It wasn't a good look. It was a better look for China. So thinking about three segments of the vaccine supply chain, there's vaccine R&D, there's production and distribution. China has gained R&D credibility in vaccines and could manufacture different platforms, the mRNA and the standard one. But it has a really flexible distribution system. And they widely distributed vaccines. They advertised them as public goods. They looked like very good benefactors during this period. And their marketing and distribution is really their strongest asset. They have strong business ties with developing countries, can cater to their needs. Stephen Kaplan has a new book out about their strategy on globalizing patient capital, but they take a long-term view. And even though they were a newcomer to vaccine development, they needed to prove efficacy. So they didn't have enough cases domestically, so they had to do their phase 3 clinical trials to get emergency use authorization elsewhere. And so they did it in developing countries across regions with little overlap. It was very strategic. They had a number of producers, and they launched their clinical trials, and they also engaged in commercial contracts. If these trials are successful, they're going to buy our vaccine. They were also really flexible, whereas the United States intellectual property owners are very reluctant to transfer technology. They don't want to share. The vaccine developers were flexible. They're like, we can give you finished vaccines, we can give you ready to fill ingredients, we could give you raw materials, we'll transfer technology so you can produce it, we'll give you training, machinery for production, or even do a joint venture with a local firm to jointly produce vaccines. So these were very attractive, especially for countries that were hoping to become regional hubs of pharmaceutical production. So these joint ventures gave China a good foothold in these countries, but also there were some attractions to it. It wasn't they were hoarding their IP the way that the United States does. So they secured large commercial orders. They donated a lot of vaccines. That was more for geopolitical reasons. And you'll have access to these slides, so I'm going to buzz through them just so that I can wind up now. But at any rate, China has proven itself to be a reliable supplier. They also use the WHO and were able to get, they didn't challenge the WHO. So you ask about international, multilateral governance. WHO, they actually used it effectively and were able to get emergency use authorization for 2 of their vaccines, after which the companies donated $100 million to COVAX, the multilateral donation hub. And then they gave them for 11 million doses, then they gave them $100 million, which is going to cover the cost of COVAX buying the vaccines from China. So it was a pretty good strategy. But there are many Chinas, and winding up now, we need to disaggregate the state. Some segments are decentralized in China, some are internationalized. Some sectors are competitive, others are in development, and that creates different preferences around trade. But the Westphalian assumptions of China as a unitary state behemoth really overlooks variation in Chinese sectors and Chinese behavior. And I also think it prevents us from thinking creatively about potential solutions for cooperation. So the way forward in the future of trade governance, some people argue we should have open plurilateralism where anyone could join a plurilateral agreement instead of this more sneaky way the US was trying to do it but failed with TPP. And then you could join ex ante or ex post, whatever you want, and you could get technology transfer so that the incumbents could help you, get your trade regime up to snuff in a particular area. Another suggestion is incrementalism. Those single round, like the Doha round with multiple issues, that's probably done. That's done for a while. I don't see that coming back anytime soon. The question is, who's going to make the rules that everyone has to follow? Thus far, China can block rules, as it has. It's blocked what the US wanted, which was for China to open its markets much more and not be treated as get special differential treatment as a developing country. It can block rules, but not create them. However, it is starting to develop that's because it has such structural power, size of the economy. But they are trying to develop institutional capacity with the Belt and Road Initiative and also the Asian Infrastructure Development Bank. So, with the terrible situations going on in the world today, which of course underscore why it's important to think about peaceful cooperation and try to come up with solutions, COVID-19 and war in Ethiopia, war in Ukraine, is globalization on pause, or is it in reverse? There's a lot of discussion about, more self-sufficiency, and global supply chains have been severely disrupted both through the pandemic and now through war. So that's another question. And finally, I just want to end with this quote from Terry Halliday, who is a legal scholar, socio-legal scholar. And I think this is very wise, and this is what we need to think about. if the diagnoses are flawed, like what's the problem here? Is China a big rival threat, or is it a peaceful rise? If we get it wrong, and contradictions, which there are many within China itself, as the China paradox suggests, contradictions fuel instability, and indeterminacy sows regulatory confusion. As long as those things are present, and they're all present right now in the US-China relationship, then global norms are going to remain in flux. Cycles of global, local reform efforts will continue, and normative convergence on an authentically negotiated universal standards, they're going to falter. So I think these are the things that we need to focus on. And then my last two slides, I thank you for listening, and you'll be able to see these later, but I'm listing a couple things that I've recently read that I think are really quite excellent. So I want to just put those out there so you can, and I use some of this research in my presentation. And that's it. Thank you very much for listening.
Oliver, you have to open the mic.
I'm terribly sorry, I muted myself by mistake. Thank you very much indeed, Susan. Extremely interesting and helpful analysis and stripping away some of the mythologies and the simplistic assertions to which this discussion is sometimes subjected. And I think we want to come back specifically to the 4 questions you posed at the end there about ways forward in the discussion that follows the presentations. I just wanted to check before coming to Pasi whether Daniele Archibuti has now joined us. Marina, are you aware of him having joined us?
No, I've called him.
Okay, fine. So, Pasi, shall we move to you now if you're ready to pop your slides up and give your presentation, and then we'll either move on to Daniele or directly into a discussion after that. So over to you, Pasi. Is Pasi not with us at the moment?
We seem to have lost him too.
Ah.
It might be that he has problems with the, as he said, he had problems with the bandwidth, but I'm sure he'll be back soon. I'll email him too.
Right. We seem to be fated. I apologize to those listening.
He's here now. He's here now.
So. Excellent.
So sorry, awfully sorry. I dropped off at the crucial stage of the proceedings. Now, Oliver, am I understanding that I should be on next?
Yes, if you would. Thank you very much, Pasi. Yes, sorry, you wouldn't have heard me saying it. Yes, I think it's not yet with us. I think we should go straight into your presentation if you'd like to pop your slides up. Thank you very much.
Right. Okay. Thanks. And you should be seeing the first of my, I mean, the headline slide now. Okay. This is the globalized economy that we used to know, sort of. I mean, it started with the opening of trade and lowering of barriers, and which led to the value chains, global value chains, and relocation of production efficiencies and cost gains. It led to economies becoming more and more intertwined, and of course a spread of technological development, more automatization, more digitalization, and surfacification of the economy. I mean, as you see from the slide there, the US economy is pretty much services these days, and hence that is the same case for all countries, including developing countries, and it, I mean, it just shows that services is very much today's trade as such. The developments have also led to a change in which global business is being conducted. I mean, it used to be in the past pretty much multinationals. Then you have with the digitalization, you have now the possibilities of even the SMEs to participate in world economy in totally different way than it was possible like 50 years ago, for instance. And then in addition, you have the state-owned enterprises competing also on the market very much so after the especially after the rise of China that Susan was also telling about. Now, this is a graph from World Trade Report in 2021 about the global trade showing resilience with the pandemic. I mean, the world trade did take a steep hit before, but before the Russian aggression in Ukraine, there was a recovery well underway. The dip was steep, but the recovery was quicker than, for instance, from the global economic and financial crisis in 2008 and 2009. And by the WTO researchers, it was attributed to the interdependence of global economy. And that interdependence, yes, it creates vulnerabilities, but the interdependence also contributes essentially to the shape and speed or lack thereof of the recovery. The response to the pandemic was more or less the correct one, in the sense that I mean, after the initial restrictions on PPEs and later then in vaccines, there was more trade facilitating measures around the globe than restrictive measures. So it would seem that by and large, countries would understand the value of keeping markets, the borders open, keeping markets open, and being liberal about the trade. Now, this is a graph of the world trade showing the cumulative effects of or restrictions on trade, goods trade, that is, by G20 nations. And as you can see, around 10% of global trade in 2020 is restricted among the G20 nations, which is pretty much the bulk of global trade. That 90% of trade is free. It's clear that that 10% restrictions is a big size. Fact that some of that is probably protectionist in nature. It is hampering global growth for sure. And you can see the uptick there in the trade restrictive measures from 2017 onwards. Basically is the sort of captures really the US-China trade war essentially over the next years. Now, and that sort of raises the question of what sort of globalization we are looking at in 2020s. I mean, we have the unilateral measures. Susan mentioned 301 measures that are targeting China. The bulk of Chinese American trade is hampered by tariffs. Then you have economic nationalism of all sorts around the globe. I mean, I don't know if well, there are for sure middle nations that are not suffering from that disease, but quite a lot of countries are. There's protectionism, which is probably going to get worse. I mean, the graph that I showed in the last slide was, of course, the state of play of for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So, and you will be seeing trade-related measures there on. well, hopefully not years, but that will mean that that the graph that will be looking worse when the next World Trade Report comes out. There is, I believe, more state intervention in the markets these, and the reactions to the pandemic, and probably we'll see that that bit more also. And you can sort of witness a sort of a globalization of a slowing of globalization. In fact, the OECD, for instance, has been looking at this phenomenon already quite some time, and they have been recording the shortening of global value chains since 2012 by 50 kilometers each year. So, I mean, in 10 years' time, the value chains have sort of shortened over 500 kilometers in that period of time. The reasons for that shortening of the value chains are not entirely clear. The OECD is still working on it, but there are explanations there too. Now, at the same time, I think globalization is becoming more regional. There are regional trade agreements, the CPTPP, the RCEP, the AFCFTA in Africa, and of course even the Eurasian Economic Union, the Russian modeled framework was trying to negotiate more free trade agreements with their trading partners. So I think it's fair to say that the liberalization of world trade has regionalized quite a bit since the early 2000s, and we still have what you see as weakness of international institutions as well, and all of those preceding phenomena affecting to that weakness. Now, turning to the WTO and its challenges, and I fully realize that that I'm going through the same issues as Susan did. And first we have, of course, the negotiations where the DDA went nowhere. The permanent negotiating body that the WTO was supposed to become has failed to deliver for the most part. And there has been a sort of notable unwillingness of some big players to enter into new commitments. And of course, the consensual decision-making nature of the WTO proves a challenge. As a result, the system of rules is not up to date, and then most rules stem from the 1980s, which means that the sort of 20th century trade challenges are pretty much left unaddressed. Then you have the other pillar of the WTO, the administration of treaties. There we suffer from lack of transparency. There's problems with monitoring of how countries abide by their commitments. There's a disregard of by some countries of their obligations in that regard. Some members fall short at obligations due to capacity constraints, for sure. Others due to more questionable reasons. And the more that happens, the more the system is being eroded. And monitoring of trade is sometimes really difficult because of lack of transparency of members' policies. And finally, you have the jewel in the crown, as it was said, the dispute settlement that is in particular limbo at the moment because of the dispute settlement body lacking the final stage where you can resolve trade disputes. That final stage and the dispute settlement system in general would need to be restored and probably reformed, since the system has not been performing quite optimally for quite some time. In addition, you have the challenges with regard to the institutional setting, and Susan alluded to that as well a bit. And there are sort of multilateralism purists who view the plurilaterals as an anathema to the world trading system, and the same purists I think are probably happy that the multilateral system has failed to deliver for so long. But plurilateralism in and of itself is nothing new, and so hence an increased plurilateralism should probably be viewed not as a threat to the multilateral trading system, since given the inability to strike multilateral deals, it's only natural that those members who want to continue down the path of liberalizing or facilitating trade should be allowed to do so. And then there's the question of the special and differential treatment, and as Susan was alluding to that as well, that's one of the challenges, given the fact that in the WTO you can designate yourself as a developing country if you like. I mean, it's self-designation, and I mean, if some of you may recall that President Trump was musing when he was in power that perhaps the US should designate itself also as a developing country, so that they could make use of the possibilities of the special and differential treatment. Now, the problem is evident because some countries who are designated as developing countries are much wealthier than developed countries, and basically the most advanced developing countries are advanced enough players in the world trading system that they should not be giving too much additional leeway in terms of obligations, because I mean I fully accept Susan's premise that China is a developing country, because it is. On the other hand, they are totally I mean in terms of structure and working as a country, they are totally able to assume obligations in the WTO. The EU has made proposals about need-based agreement, case by case, special and differential treatment. So we'll see, and the US has as well. It remains to be seen whether those proposals will fly, because basically, I mean, you would need to come to an agreement on of a deal if that's going to fly. There's very little empirical evidence, I would say, as a matter of fact, that the special and differential treatment would give anybody a massive competitive advantage in world trade, but it's the optics that count. And then in the end, you have the current challenge of the disruption by war. And we don't know what sort of spillover effects on global trade it has. And it's impacting world trade already, but what sort of conclusions trade-wise or trade policy-wise countries will draw from it, it's far from clear. Would there be more regionalization? It's not impossible. Would there be more closing up of borders, more strategic autonomy? It's not impossible either. But would there be a possibility to organize world trade in such a way that recovery could be felt speedily and widely across the globe? It's not impossible, but the history has not been kind in the sense that this sort of sentiment has not had a too lasting effect in the past. But we'll see about that. I'm personally optimist by nature. Turning to China now, I mean, they've been members since 2001, and there are various complaints about China in the WTO. I mean, that they are not opening up, not becoming market economy. They are not playing their part. They are not playing by the rules, and also that the rules are not working. This is a graph, I mean, about not opening up, not becoming market economy. by Dan Churiak from Canada about how world trade opened up after Chinese accession. I mean, and you can see from the graph that it really opened up both in terms of imports and exports. And it's, I mean, China did open up. It's true that the economic development in China has not been that of continuous liberalization of markets since the WTO accession, but there have been efforts to liberalize the economy, and one cannot deny that China is a market with quite fierce internal competition. On the other hand, there has been also a slowing down of liberalization in the last years, and a certain increase in the role of state in the economy. Having said that, it's not that WTO as a whole has experienced massive liberalization during the time when China has been participating. But I mean, all in all, it's not to say that other countries have not benefited from the opening up of China. Now to the question of China not playing their part. China is a major player in the WTO and wields considerable power in the corridors. And China has been quite vocal in defense of multilateral rules-based system. But it probably has not quite walked the talk, I would say. In terms of further trade liberalization, China was reluctant in the early 2000s, following quite a demanding accession to enter into new commitments, and was part of a recently acceded members group that wanted to limit new commitments in the ongoing round, the Doha round. On NAMA sectorals, which didn't really get off, China had clearly problems with chemical goods liberalization, for instance. And it has to be agreed that the accession to government procurement agreement, for instance, it has taken massive amount of time. I mean, they promised to do that. It's still in the making 20 years after the fact, after joining. On the other hand, China has signed on to the ITA2 expansion, for instance, on information technology products, and China is being taking part in negotiations also, not just multilaterally, but also on joint plurilateral joint statement initiatives, so-called. And on some topics, they've been the main instigators, like the investment facilitation for development or the plastics initiative. And they did sign on to the Services Domestic Regulation Agreement. Now, some members have insisted that China should stop considering itself a developing country in the WTO context and should take as ambitious commitments in the negotiations as developed countries. While China is reluctant to let go of its status as developing country, it's been open to not availing itself of special and differential treatment, for instance, with regard to the fisheries negotiation. As those have not been yet concluded, we cannot as of now assess as to how constructive Chinese would be in terms of commitments in those negotiations in the end. And then there's the part of not playing by the rules. I think it's fair to say that China has been underperforming in the committee work, where members keep track of implementation of each other's obligations with regard to specific agreements, like domestic support obligations in the Agreement on Agriculture, where China was found to be in breach of its domestic support obligations not too long ago. Notifications have not been submitted on time, and it has sometimes taken years to materialize. And there's a lack of transparency of Chinese policies and unwillingness to respond to members' questions in the trade policy review, for instance. And there's also petty politicization of the work. I mean, consider, for instance, that Hong Kong is currently hindering a Taiwanese colleague to become the chair of the GPA, the Government Procurement Agreement Committee, where China is not a member, but Hong Kong is. And then there are the breaches of the WTO commitments and obligations, and that's the sort of major criticism by the United States, the EU, and others. And China has been found to have acted inconsistently with its obligations in multiple trade disputes. Now, has China been worse than other major trading nations? There, I think it depends on who you ask. I mean, China has been target of a lot of complaints. I mean, they take the second position in terms of complaints in the WTO since 2004, if you calculate that, with just behind the United States. On the other hand, it would seem that China, when they are found to be in breach of their obligations, they have sought to comply with the dispute settlement body recommendations. True, it has not. It has sometimes taken time, and sometimes it's work in progress still. But it would be difficult to claim that China has been more problematic in terms of honoring dispute settlement recommendations than other major players. China is also a party to the MPIA, which is the sort of arbitration solution to the lack of appellate body that we have now, which shows that they have an interest in trying to resolve disputes in a rules-based fashion. On the other hand, then you have cases where China has been using trade defense instruments as a retaliation tool, which is not something that the US or the EU have been guilty of in the past anyway. And so they have not really been keeping up with the rules-based ethos in that regard. And then you have the recent cases of that seem to be about economic coercion for political ends. I mean, we can talk about what is happening in China-Lithuania trade. We can talk about what's happening in China-Australia trade, and the Philippines, etc. I mean, unfair trading practices by China that unsettle global trade, and members have been trying to address those problems through tariffs, like in the US-China trade war, or negotiations like the EU negotiations on comprehensive agreement on investment, and by amplifying trade defenses like the EU trade instruments of recent years, from investment screening to international procurement instruments to distortive foreign subsidies instrument in the single market. And the latest is the anti-coercion instrument that is being prepared in the council bodies. But as I said earlier, there are obvious problems with the fact that trade rules stem mostly from the late 1980s. This can be partially remedied through ongoing negotiations, and here I'm thinking of e-commerce in particular. There are other proposals on the table, even if their future now looks uncertain given the war, like on trade and sustainable development, which could provide for further liberalization of environmental goods and services. Then you have the trade and health initiative that has encompasses not just IP issues, but also export restrictions and possible opening up of trade in medical goods. You have the whole issue of services negotiations. I mean, that was the inbuilt agenda of the Uruguay round. The services negotiations were supposed to start in 2000. They went nowhere. And so there are probably possibilities there as well to make the WTO more relevant and more China relevant as well. And then you have the possibility of if you are continuing with the plurilateral side, you can do sectoral non-agricultural market access deals as well, provided, of course, that there's a critical mass of countries willing to do that. Finally, then there's the question of the top topics about the level playing field, sort of that the Americans, the Europeans, and Japanese have tried to address by a sort of trilateral work or bilaterally, be it through the phase 1 negotiations or the comprehensive agreement on investment. And these relate to state subsidies, distortive practices of state-owned enterprises in the market, and forced technology transfer. That work is still ongoing, even if the US has secured, as part of their agreement of phase 1, a prohibition of forced tech transfer, a practice that China denies in the and the EU managed to get transparency measures on subsidies and some commitments on state-owned enterprises operating on commercial basis in the CAI, but that agreement is now on hold. On the subsidies, there are issues that need revisiting, or beefing up of the actual disciplines, definition of public body, and the controversial interpretation thereof by the appellate body. While it can be argued that members have not made use of all possibilities to address the problems, it is also clear that the WTO system requires updates, especially but not only with regard to the ASCM, and we need the operational dispute settlement system. Is competitive neutrality the way? Difficult to say. It might be politically opportune given the fact that there are a lot of other countries who have been giving out lavish subsidies to enterprises during the pandemic and some way before that. Now the EU is wanting to negotiate rules on that topic in the WTO. Let's see what comes out of that. I think in one of the ways to manage this Sino-Western relations and the interdependence is for members to commit to strengthening the trading system and reforming the WTO, and you have to have China on board. We need to have the US there, obviously working along, because without the US it's really difficult to see the reform work going anywhere. I think it's clear that China has to play along as well, in the sense that it's difficult to imagine that they would just accept a diktat from the US and the EU about the necessary changes in the rule book. They have to get something in return. What that something is, it's an open question. Some of that might be about loosening of some of the tariffs that are clearly contrary to WTO rules, and we'll see whether that can be accommodating the Chinese somewhat. In addition, I think we have the situation where you have a sort of strategic battle over technological hegemony, if you like, and you have competition with security implications. And you have vulnerabilities and critical dependencies that have been exposed not just by the pandemic, but by the trade war as well. Now, normal economic competition is necessary and should be welcomed and enhanced, but there are issues with the state capitalist practices that create market distortions and need to be addressed as well. And these can be partially dealt with the WTO system, while they require the updates that I mentioned. Some distortions probably will necessitate other instruments, examples of which range from those designed for international procurement or subsidies affecting market conditions in the single market. Dependencies are in and of itself not a risk, but they can become one in conflict situations. And dependencies can be mitigated in various ways, including by diversifying one's sources of supply, strategic stockpiling, creating additional production capacity, and all that sort of thing. Companies are doing that all the time. Vulnerabilities can be evaluated via investment screening and in cooperation with other partners, and by enacting necessary policies on export controls, for instance. The US and the EU are currently discussing the possibilities of working on secure supply chains, and that's one of the topics of the Trade and Technology Council that the EU and the US have. At the moment, I think the problem in the Sino-Western relations is that the security concerns are probably too pronounced, There are real concerns that need to be addressed, given the situation in China as well, but it's hard to argue that all Chinese tech or all Chinese acquisitions pose a threat to the West. Yes, there are risks, and yes, there are practices that should be curtailed, but at the same time, we should be allowing the exchange of normal low-risk products and services and investment. I mean, not all economic activity, even in the high-tech sector, is a security threat. I mean, I was talking about WTO mostly, but there are other economic governance institutions like the OECD that I didn't touch upon, and it would need another seminar. There are more than 260 OECD legal acts and instruments, from recommendations to best practices, where we probably would benefit from having China adhering to them. I mean, wouldn't it be good if China were adhering to the anti-bribery convention? Wouldn't it not be good that if they were following the M&E, multinational enterprises guidelines, or if they were to join the export credit arrangements? It might be because the OECD recommendations, decisions, and best practices are mostly soft law. It might be easier for China to sign on to that. They haven't in the past, and there are clearly limits at the moment about the Chinese willingness to adhere to OECD instruments. But I think that is one avenue that we should be looking forward, looking further on in the future. And finally, you have the question of the G20 and whether that can take a position as a global economic governance body. I mean, the results so far are mixed, but I would say that if you can find a modus operandi for the biggest economies in the world to operate within the G20 framework, that might prove also fruitful for managing of the Sino-Western interdependence. Thank you very much. I'll stop here.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Pasi. It's full of insights and possibilities, some of which are complementary to those from Susan and some significantly different, and we'll come back to all of that in the discussion. I think we should focus on those different views of the way forward. But in the meanwhile, Daniel has joined us, and I don't know, Daniel, whether you have hi. I don't know whether you have slides to share, but if you'd like to launch into your presentation, that would be terrific, and then we'll come to a discussion. I'll when we get to the end of your session, I will try to bring out some points from all three, so you'll become aware of what's said at that point.
Yeah, first of all, let me apologize. I made a silly mistake. I assumed that Helsinki 2 was into the same time zone than Rome. And yes, that's the reason why I expected to be, I believed I was half an hour early, but I was half an hour late.
Yes, no, we thought that might have been what had happened. So no
I do apologize about that.
No problem at all. You're here now.
But that's it tells you very much how somebody of my generation has difficulties with the online life. You know, despite 2 years in which we are making this life, I'm not yet used. Well, I listened with great interest what Pasi Heikki has been said. And indeed, is a very broad picture about one international organization. My approach on the future of multilateral economic governance is, if you like, a bit complementary to that. And it doesn't look at trade, but it looks at what companies do. And to what extent we can really sustain an economic governance when we have a certain amount of companies which do things in a different way. And being trained in the Schumpeterian fashion, I would suggest that not all companies are equal. And if you look at the distribution of industries, you have got some companies which are more equal than others. And these are the companies which act on the new developments and which are very much pervasive to the economic fabric. I mean, the war in Ukraine is showing that, as usual in wars, that raw materials also become crucial. And you really see how the geopolitics across countries very much influence to what different companies manage to do and what different countries manage to have. This is something which was already somehow discussed yesterday, but it's quite clear. But still, in the long run, I assume that raw materials are more easily can be substituted more easily than the competencies associated to core new technologies. And the story now is very simple. In the core of what is leading the world, which, by the way, allows us to interact today online, is a restricted oligopoly of American corporations, you know? And you really see that these corporations are very much designing the future. So oil is important, for sure, but the core material of our age is data processing, information communication technologies, and those who have an advantage in this area are very likely to dominate the world. And we need to be aware about that. Of course, this is strongly associated to the total amount of effort that countries put into in creating new opportunities. One proxy of that is the R&D expenditure that each country can afford. And here we have got the typical picture, which was already shown for trade indicators and for any other indicators. We really see that over the last 20 years, China made a major jump forward, and now China is spending in terms of R&D as much as the European Union, and in absolute terms is even spending more. Of course, China has a larger population, but also in proportion to its GDP, you really see that we have to face a new challenge. So the total geography of inventions and innovations has been redesigned, like in trade, like in many other economic variables, and really we have here to accommodate a new player. Now, which are the corporations behind that? And you really see that these corporations are, you know, with a few entrants, Samsung, for example, Volkswagen, but again, Volkswagen is active mostly in a traditional industry, motor vehicles, 100 years old, more than 100 years old industry. And then we start to have the Chinese corporations, which are strongly investing in R&D. These are the companies which are designing the future. And the last two are two in the pharmaceutical and biotechnology sector. There is a line there which is what the public intervention of Europe can do. I've taken the average amount of investment of Horizon 2020. Many of the colleagues which are speaking today and yesterday are colleagues which have been involved in projects associated with Horizon 2020. Is a highly widespread program, very important program for the European Union. All in all, the total amount of the investment of this program is comparable or even lower to what companies such as Amazon or Alphabet or Microsoft invest into the generation of new ideas, of new products, processes, and services. So also in terms, if you like, of the total amount of resources which Europe is affording in order to compete with its American counterparts, you really see that the instruments are definitely not comparable with what other corporations can do. So one approach that the European Union is trying to do, and which also, if you like, other countries are trying to do, including China, including the United States, is to get mission-oriented actions. And that's something which was advocated by my mentor, Christopher Freeman, at the University of Sussex already in the 90s, and which are now repeated with quite a lot of strength by Marianna Mazzucato, which is also teaching at the University of London in just in front of my college. We are two colleges, one in front of the others. And why this is quite important? It's important because Europe is now in a situation in which is challenging an already established oligopoly. And if we look at what can be done compared to what was already done in the United States through, for example, space and military programs, indeed, already 30 years ago, Freeman pointed out that we needed to move in a direction which was more decentralized and more able to involve a plurality of actors. So, a European strategy which, if properly implemented, could have somehow reacted to the creation of the American oligopoly of the big techs. Take into account that back in 1992, it was not at all clear how this oligopoly would have been created. Facebook was not there. Microsoft was a small company. Amazon was not there, But still, there was an idea of companies which were exploiting quite a lot of these sort of activities. So if I can, see now what are the challengers of the big tech American corporations, and now, speaking for Finnish colleagues, I will raise also a painful story. You will find out that we have got Chinese counterparts, not European counterparts. Nokia, for example, could have been one of the European counterparts challenging at least Apple, but as you know better than I do, is not any longer available. And unfortunately, in these core sectors, we do not have anything comparable to the American top corporations in the field. So this is basically my story, and this story leaves you quite a lot of considerations. Do we need to have not just the external control which public policy can have through regulations, through antitrust policies, or anything like that? For example, the European Union is very active in order to regulate data. And as you know, there are quite a lot of constraints in terms of what you can do or what you cannot do, which is fine. But we do not have any internal control on these corporations for the simple reasons that the headquarters of these corporations, the top managers and so on, are not directly associated to the governments of European countries. There are some interesting examples, and the interesting examples are, for example, what the European Union is doing with the European Battery Alliance, a widespread diffusion activity which hopefully will lead Europe to be a leader in one of the core sectors of the new technological frontier, and that's fine. But that perhaps is not enough unless Europe also manages to implement production with its own companies. I'm almost finished, and I would like to say something more about historical examples. Can really Europe create a counterpart to the established American oligopoly and to the Chinese challengers? I don't know how many of you in the audience have got young kids, teenagers, you know. And I have one, my younger daughter is 17, and my 17-year-old daughter spends a lot of time on TikTok. So she's on a social network which, of course, is not, it's the only social network which is not American, but still is very much taking the younger generation. And therefore, it's very likely that within 20 years, 30 years, might be more important than Facebook, Twitter, and all the Instagram and all the other social networks. And it's not surprisingly that when TikTok wanted to enter into the United States, the Trump administration wanted to make sure not only that complied with regulation issues, but raised a question of security about the ownership of TikTok. And for somebody like me, which has seen only silly videos on TikTok of teenagers dancing and showing the belly, it's very difficult to understand why TikTok became a problem of national security for the United States, you know. But at the end, this was what the United States wanted to do and managed to do. The past. I got two tales. One is Concorde, one Airbus. Both of them were ventures strongly supported by European governments. The first started as an Anglo-French venture, the second as a French-German venture. These were one failure and one success. The failure was Concorde, very spectacular achievement of the two European empires, commercially was a failure, didn't last long. The success was Airbus. Airbus was strongly supported. It managed to have, as we know from the World Trade Organization, a lot of complaints and geopolitical discussion and whatever it happened. But at the end of the day, that's one of the few cases in which a genuinely European public support corporation managed to enter into the market and somehow even managed to redraw the structure which before Airbus was totally in the hands of a restricted number of American corporations. It was a restricted American oligopoly compared to what we have got now in the big tech corporations. So my story is finished because Concorde is a very good product. It manages to serve a lot of good things. Now that its American competitor Boeing started to have some basic problems, it saved consumers and helped consumers everywhere, including in the United States. And perhaps we should somehow try to learn something about that also for the emerging industries. I repeat, Europe is not challenging, and therefore this might pose a serious problem, which is, I think, more relevant than the supply of gas and oil for the economy of the 21st century. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Daniel. That's very helpful. If you remove your slides for a moment, then we can, I think, all see one another.
Yep, sorry, I will.
Thank you very much indeed. We have a period now to enter into discussion, and I want to try to guide this discussion in a particular direction which emerges from thinking through the three presentations. I think there are three particular questions in my mind, having listened to the three presentations, and the first, each of which relates incidentally to the question of where now. Is it possible, Daniele, to remove those slides?
Yes, of course.
Marvelous, excellent, good.
Sorry about that.
No. Thank you very much. That's splendid. And Pasi, you've disappeared again. No, you're there. You're there somewhere. You're on mute, I think, Pasi. Pasi, are you around? I can see VP and I can see a mute sign. I apologize, Susan. And I want, if possible, Pasi, to hear this, set the framework. Can you hear us, Pasi? You're on mute.
I can hear you, but I didn't hear you just a while ago.
Great. Sorry, I think you must have dropped off. The technology is coming and going a bit. Can you hear us now? Okay.
Yeah, I can.
You can. Okay. Good. Good. So yes. So I wanted to raise three specific questions, discuss each of them in turn. I think the first that arises in my mind, in a sense, is provoked by Daniele's extremely interesting perspective on all this, and that's the question: should we actually be aiming at trying to find new models of governance, which essentially was the sort of essay question and the one that Susan and Pasi offered some prospective possible answers to, or should we, on the contrary, as I think Daniele is suggesting, should we be focusing instead on the issue of how to create a more dynamic and productive global trading system by ensuring that we're not in the hands globally of oligopolies, whether established by China or by the US or indeed anybody else. So should we be focusing on trying to promote competitive global dynamics through the formation of companies and industrial strategy, or should we be aiming at governance? That's the first question I wanted to raise. And then just before we discuss that, just to illustrate the second and third question, the second question I want to raise is, and this in a sense comes out of the contrast between Pasi's talk and Susan's, should we be focusing, if we are going to focus at all on governance, either in addition to industrial strategy or instead of focusing on industrial strategy as a means of opening global trade, should we be focusing on the existing institutions? In Pasi's case, he was focusing specifically on the WTO, or on new approaches outside the existing institutions. And then third question I'd like to raise, if and to the extent we should be focusing on new approaches to governance, i.e. focusing on governance, but focusing on new approaches rather than the WTO or other existing institutions. If we are going to go for new methods, should that be in the form of forsaking an effort at universalism and moving to one of the variants that both Pasi and Susan mentioned, plurilateralism, regionalization, or whatever, or should it be through a new form of global governance. Pasi mentioned, for example, G20 as a possible route to that. So let's start though with the sort of radical issue which Daniela's paper raises, which is the suggestion that at least one of the ways we should collectively try to deal with a world dominated by Sino-US rivalry in the most important new industries is by promoting industrial challenge rather than by trying to govern our way out of this. And I think what I'd like to do is to start by asking both Susan and then Pasi, in responding to Daniel's very interesting and radical suggestion there, do you see this as either or? We have to choose between industrial strategy and attempts at governance, or do you think that it's compatible with trying to promote a more up-to-date and more effective forms of governance of whatever kind? We'll come on to that. To be also doing what Daniel was suggesting and trying to disrupt intense rivalry between rival oligopolies promoted by respectively the Chinese and the US. Should we start, Susan, with you? And either or both and?
Gosh, such an easy question. Thanks for that, Oliver. I think both and is fine. I mean, I think every country should try to figure out what they can be good at, and I don't have a problem with industrial policy. I mean, everyone has some kind of, especially if they have a military. I mean, the U.S. military-industrial complex is quite the industrial policy, despite what we said Japan just had in the 80s. Well, we have our own. But I think, this is a complicated problem. I think that takes solutions at pretty much every level, whether it's through changing industrial strategy or fixing the rules of governance. I mean, I think Pasi had some really great suggestions of practical things that we could work on now. But I think there's also opportunities around, and this relates to Daniela's point about oligopoly. I mean, one of the biggest problems we're facing, I think, in global economy is really stark inequality and growing inequality. I know China's facing that domestically. There's been a huge increase in inequality between haves and have-nots within China. But globally, I mean, millions have been lifted out of poverty, but the distribution of that has been much more concentrated among the top 1%, partly because of the Uruguay round has something to do with that, because the returns on certain kinds of investment, like in intellectual property and trademark brand management, have just gotten so high that when you look at the smile curve, if you follow a product from R&D and invention all the way to production and brand management at the other end, it's the owners of intellectual property that are at the top of those ends of the smile, and they're reaping huge rewards and with small labor footprints, companies like Apple. Whereas the people that are actually producing things like Foxconn in China, they're at the bottom. So I think that smile curve used to be a lot flatter. And with the gig economy, workers are even getting pushed deeper down to the bottom of the smile, and the returns that they're getting are decreasing. So this very skewed distribution of resources, I think, and concentration at the top, fed by companies like Apple and Microsoft, and all the ones that Amazon, the ones that Daniela put on his slides. I think that's a problem everyone's facing now. I think that's part of the reason we see a rise in populism from the left and the right. There's been a real change in a commitment to a more stable, more equitable distribution of resources. And I think that's something that is worth thinking about. And some elements of competition policy would be useful. Like the EU is trying with their data regulation, but to try and tame the power of these oligopolies. But I think we have to think really creatively about the kind of problems that we're creating, both for the environment and also for people's life chances. And with the COVID situation, I think has been an opportunity for us to see what we call essential workers are actually the ones that are at the bottom of earnings and the bottom of having benefits and all those kind of things. So I think the distribution needs to really change. And in this, I agree with some of the work that Mariana Mazzucato and William Lazanik have done, that those that are extracting value are getting much higher returns than those that are actually creating value. And and those are regulatory choices. And a lot of those choices came through in the Uruguay round, and that's led to dissatisfaction with the trading system. And I think we need to have even those deeper conversations about what we want 21st century capitalism to look like, and what goals what's the social purpose of changing these rules or dealing with governance and trying to reduce overfishing. I mean, we really need to think, I think deeply about the social purpose of governance and different ways we can address these deeper dysfunctional elements of the contemporary global economy.
Susan, can I just before we go back to Pasi, can I just press you on this both and part of that answer? I completely understand the point about the inequities and the role that governance in principle could play in trying to address those. We'll come onto that more in a moment. But is both and really plausible? I mean, if others try to join the game, so to speak, that both the US and China are engaged in, of seeking to establish oligopolies at what you call the two ends of the smile curve, to capture the returns. All those parties that do join in, surely then don't they just acquire the same vested interests that the China and the US have, and therefore begin to be rivals in the same way, and hence militate against kinds of governance that attempt globally to make a more equal world and distribute returns more evenly?
I think in a way. Well, I think in a way, though, that it's both and, but you have to change. I think you have to change the rules. I think you have to really change the incentives, because, for example, I mean, there's a lot of regulatory changes that could happen that would reduce that skewing and would increase competition, so that you wouldn't have to become an Apple to be successful. You wouldn't have to, you wouldn't be maybe allowed to be an Apple anymore. I think there needs to be, I mean, Mazzucato, for example, writes about the entrepreneurial state. And in fact, most of those companies that are reaping the share of the rewards in the United States anyway, and China as well, they were, built by a lot of government investment, and with DARPA in particular. And yet the profits they get, and pharmaceutical industry is very, very much the case there too, the National Institutes of Health. But with all this public investment, but only one, then the corporation gets all the private reward, and taxpayers are ending up paying for things twice. So, the success of these companies is not at all reflecting the amount of state support that they had in the U.S. with Amazon, with Apple, with Microsoft, the pharmaceutical firms. And I think that balance needs to, I mean, we need more transparency around that in terms of what percentage of taxpayer dollars built these companies. And, the libertarian ethos is very strong in the United States, and the genius inventor, but in fact, without all that public support, they wouldn't be where they are. So I think we need to really rethink some of those regulatory structures and the incentives and the rewards, allow stock buybacks. So, I mean, the whole shareholder model is problematic as well. When executive compensation is about, keeping your share price high. And so instead of investing back in your company or your people, what you do is you shed labor, and then you buy stocks back on the open market to inflate the price and give it to shareholders. So I think there's been a real disconnect between businesses and who they're really serving, and what kind of goods they're providing. And the pharmaceutical incentive, but the incentives are problematic. So, you know, I read some congressional testimony of a pharmaceutical executive from Merck, and Merck used to make vaccines, and we had a big vaccine shortage in the 70s and 80s. And they got out of the vaccine business then. We had shortages of standard childhood vaccines. And the company said, well, you know, the congressional hearings, he said, I'd love to keep making vaccines. That's what we've been doing. We've been making good vaccines, but they're not profitable. They're low profit items. And so Wall Street is going to come in. There'll be a hostile takeover of my company, and they're going to put in a CEO that will reduce costs and increase shareholder returns to shareholders. So he felt, you know, structurally unable to go back to the business that they were good at, and also by having so much executive compensation, stock-based versus salary-based creates that incentive. So the Merck guy wasn't a bad guy, but there were these regulatory structures that made him make choices to get away from providing things that were actually good for more people. So I mean, that's just a little taste, but I think the regulatory structures are really important, and the incentives, and those need to change. They were changed in the 80s pretty significantly. We can change them again, I think, in a more equitable way.
Okay, so your answer really is that in order to tame this kind of global rivalry and create a more equal world, we need to not just try to compete with the oligopoly, but to make the oligopoly themselves less remunerative and less able to exploit the situation than at the present. And that should be the aim of the governance reforms. Pasi, what's your view on this? Are you resolutely in favor of pursuing the global governance route, or anyway, some form of governance route? Or do you think that industrial policy also has a major part to play in disrupting the US-China rivalry and mutual dominance?
Right. Well, as Susan was saying, that these are tough questions, and I would tend to agree on some of the observations. I mean, for sure, what we are witnessing today in terms of these big platform companies that have a considerable market dominance, whether in the US or in Europe or in China, is that perhaps not the sort of competition policies that should have helped in providing more competition in the market have failed to some extent over the decades in the past. And I think that's especially true, I would say, from the perspective of the US, where I think the development from the 1980s onwards has been sort of more tolerating to the growth of these sort of oligopolies as such. Now, I think we are seeing a sort of a backlash today, even in China. We are seeing a backlash in the US, and we are definitely seeing a regulatory strife in the EU to find ways of moderating the effect of these platform companies on the market. Having said that, I think, I don't know, as you know, competition is not part of the WTO, for instance. So it's really difficult to see that you could have an agreement on the way in the WTO. It was attempted in the early 2000s. It went nowhere. It's just not that is not the right institution anyway to do that. Whether you can do it some elsewhere, I mean, I don't know if that exists. It's the International Competition Network is certainly not the place either. The European Competition Network not as well. So I think we would be seeing a sort of if there would be a coherence in the regulatory approaches between the big players, the US, the EU, China, it might produce something also globally, but that remains to be seen. having said that, and I think there are problems there that we need to address. Also, I think the perspective that we have is a bit too short. I mean, we don't know what sort of, in what way these companies that we are having in the market today will be there in 15 years time, for instance. So, I mean, there will be shifts and there will be changes, and there will it'll be interesting to see whether we will have the alphabets and Microsofts and Alibabas in 15 years time. So I mean, in all fairness, I would still give some room for the market to work as well. And with regard to industrial policies or strategies, I'm fully in line with Susan that there are certainly room for that sort of work as well. We in Finland, we like to talk about smart industrial policies, which just means the state intervening in the sort of R&D activities and those sort of things. But at the same time, from my perspective, it's better to leave the industrial how would I say, the actual implementation of any industrial strategy to private companies, and that usually means that you have to have a regulatory environment where the companies feel that they can grow and become prosperous, and so the state role is less in subsidizing, but more in regulating the economy. Thank you.
So, Daniel, coming back to you then. So, I think both Susan and Pasi are essentially saying that although we may not be able, in Pasi's view, to use the existing institutions to tame these oligopolies completely, at least we could try to set market rules globally that make for fairer competition, and that's compatible. That effort is compatible with also trying to, I mean, for countries and groups of countries other than China and the US to promote through industrial strategy of one kind or another, bearing in mind Pasi's skepticism about some of them. Forms of company that enter new markets and challenge oligopolies. Were you essentially trying to say that we should give up on global governance and just focus on trying to join in the game, or were you promoting that as an addition to efforts to create more open markets, or more regulated, better regulated, more equitable markets globally?
Well, I mean, first of all, let me say that I totally share Susan's view that the income distribution within countries is a major problem. Today, we hear every day about Russian oligarchs owning an enormous amount of wealth. And what about the oligarchs in the United Kingdom, in the United States, in Italy, and so on? Let me say that there is perhaps a small difference, namely most Russian oligarchs manage to extract the wealth from raw materials, which in principle belong to everybody, while some of the billionaires, American billionaires at least, had to invent something, you know, Microsoft, Amazon, or whatever it is, to extract through also rents a lot of money. But I definitely agree. It's not good for them. It's not good for the country. It's not good for the world that there is such an uneven concentration of wealth, you know. And therefore, this is something. It's not an incentive, because up to a certain level, we need to act with fiscal policies and to redistribute the wealth, you know. And indeed, if you are from the perspective of the European Union or any other large player outside the United States and China, you really have to enter into these strategic markets. Remember what happened in the 50s and the 60s, when the most important industry was oil. Non-producing European countries and even world countries such as Italy, France, Brazil, Mexico, of course, at the time the Soviet Union, and so on, all of them started to have national companies, state-owned companies, which were trying to secure this precious energy in one way or the other. And even now in Italy, I think the largest European company is a state-owned company which deals with oil. This creates a mixed oligopoly in which there are American multinational corporations and there are other corporations from other countries, but there is at least a presence of an Italian corporation. If you look at the case of data-intensive companies, it's not like that. There are all American corporations. Take into account what we are doing now. We are using, platforms or whatever it is, which are totally outside the hands of the European Union. If for any reason there is a conflict in between the United States and Europe, similar to the conflict that now we are experiencing with Russia, we won't be able to talk. Everything will stop. Our communications will stop. We won't be able any longer to act. Is that a problem of national security or not? I do not think that this is something which can be addressed by individual European states. Not even Germany is large enough to create corporations which will be able to compete with Amazon, with Apple, with Microsoft, and so on. And therefore, I assume that this is something which the European Union should address as a union. I'm happy that PASI comes from the World Trade Organization. This is one of the few institutions in which Europe manages to speak with one voice, something which doesn't happen at all in the in the United Nations Security Council, for example, And therefore, I think that in this case, we need to do something about that. So people will argue, but what's the problem? If you look at the trade balance between the United States and Europe, we are still making a plus, and therefore, do we really want to get a commercial war with the United States for that? And I think not all commodities are equally important. Italian shoes, French perfumes are not as important as data. And and therefore I think it's important to have with all the possible cooperation something which will be able to compete with the United States. And the case of Airbus shows very clearly that when there is a restricted oligopoly, it's in the interest of everybody, including of the American consumers, that there is more than one option. Can you imagine if the world market today will be a monopoly run by Boeing? At least there are two options. It's already too small, but at least there are two options to fly from Rome to Helsinki and from Helsinki to London or whatever it is. Without the effort started in 1969, 50 years ago, of the German and the French government to start this consortium, we will be all like that in the hands of Boeing. Is that something feasible? Do we want to get something similar also for social networks? Or shall we rely only on the Chinese new entrants? And that seems to me the problem that we have to deal. If these should be left to the business sector only, or it should also be complemented by state-owned enterprises is another question. I think that at a certain point, especially at the beginning of certain industries in knowledge-intensive sectors, we will very much need some state-owned enterprises. Now, how to run state-owned enterprises is another problem. We know that often they are corrupted, that they are inefficient, and so on. And therefore, this again puts a basic problem of proper management of the public goods. And this is something on which we have to start to do it seriously.
Well, thank you. We could probably go on discussing that for some time to come. It's very, very interesting, fertile terrain. We have unfortunately only 14 minutes left. I'm going to move on to the other questions, and I think I have to collapse them into just one question, one omnibus question, in order to give the three of you a chance to say something about it. Let's take it this way. Let me start, Pasi, this time with you. You were focused on reform of the WTO, but you also mentioned a whole series of other possibilities, the soft law stuff in the OECD, G20, and so on, as ways of trying to improve on the lackluster performance of the WTO and its outdatedness in the current context. Where do you think we should be putting the emphasis? Can we hope that one way or another, one of these global efforts or a collection of global efforts will work? And if so, is it mainly the WTO we should be focusing on, or should we be looking for the alternatives? Or do we have to accept that, given the rivalries, plurilateralism and regionalism are more likely to be the shape of trade governance, with presumably ad hoc negotiations between the rival regions or plurilateral clubs? Can we continue to go global, and if so, how? Or do we have to accept that the age of globalization in governance is largely drawing to a close? Percy, you're on mute, I think. You're frozen, I think. Oh dear. This technology, Daniel, that you are trumpeting as a danger also doesn't always work.
It's even more dangerous when it doesn't work.
Just so. Okay. Well, while Pasi's frozen, I'll come to you, Susan, and ask you the same question. Can we hope for reform of global institutions, or the addition stroke replacement of WTO by other institutions globally, or are we going to have to accept plurilateralism and regionalization?
Well, it's very, very difficult to create new institutions, and there's a lot of stickiness and a lot of, it took a world war basically to get the Bretton Woods system in place. So I don't want to see a world war and the creation of new institutions as a result of World War III. So we're kind of stuck with the WTO for the moment. I think Pasi had a lot of really good suggestions about practical steps forward, to the extent that you can get consensus in some areas. And again, I think disaggregating some different pieces. He identified quite nicely some of the areas where China is very willing to cooperate in terms of negotiating different kinds of agreements, and kind of take the heat level down a bit, and to try to work on the things you can work on together. I think we're going to continue to see plurilateralism. We'll continue to see bilateral efforts. The fragmentation of the global trade system, I don't think that is going to go away anytime soon. And with the multiplicity of institutions and the regime complexity, weaponized interdependence, transnational legal orders, where these deep, since we've gotten into deep integration into domestic regulatory regimes, like government procurement being an issue, we're going to keep bumping into each other in ways that maybe we didn't anticipate or desire, and we're going to have to work with what we can and find avenues forward. But I think it also is going to take not just global governance, but governance at every level, and regulators working across borders together to try and come up with, practical solutions. There's a lot of things like trade facilitation that people are in favor of, things that make it easier for firms to do business. I mean, there are places that agreement's still possible, but until the very binary language, threat. I think that's an impediment to actually identifying places where we could actually make some progress, and maybe baby steps, but to try building trust again and trying to, and maybe that's just so idealistic. I really don't know, but we've certainly got to try.
Okay, so your recipe is kind of optimistic, messy incrementalism, where we accept the institutions we've got, we play with them, we try to identify areas where, for example, China and the US can cooperate and can bring others in and make progress. Some of the Pasi was talking about. In other areas, we have to accept there will be regionalism or plurilateralism or bilateralism. We just accept this messy scene because there's nothing we can do about it. We can make incremental improvements within it and should aim to do so. I think that's.
But on a deeper level, I think that it would be helpful if we could get the conversation going about this steepening inequality. I know China worries about it. They worry about their domestic stability. The U.S. worries about it. After the insurrection of January 6th, there's a lot of angry people, and until we really address some of those fundamental sources of that, I think it's going to get worse.
Yes, so with the proviso that all the time we should be aiming at a more equitable outcomes. So, Pasi, are you roughly speaking in agreement with that despite your emphasis on WTO and G20 and OECD and so on, actually we have to admit that there's going to be a range of solutions, only some of which will be trying to find solutions that the US and China can both buy into in the global institutions. Oh goodness! Are you there? Yes.
Pasi is sometimes frozen. Yeah.
He's also muted. His microphone's not
muted
on.
just at the moment, Pasi. Are you there? We don't seem to be getting any. Hi, are you with us?
Are you talking to me?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm having an awfully bad connection at the moment. I need to call my service to ask about it. I think you asked whether we were stuck with the WTO.
Yes, I mean, as what Susan was saying, basically that we should make such progress as we can in WTO context and other global contexts where we can get degrees of agreement between China and the US by abandoning sort of unhelpful stereotypes and searching for cooperation where it can be achieved, but accept that there will be degrees of regionalization and plurilateralism and bilateralism that go alongside it, because this is a messy scene and we should just aim to get the most equitable solutions we can out of constructively addressing that messy scene.
We have regionalization in the globalization at the moment. It's sort of natural, and you can't really find.
Oh dear. These oligopolies aren't very good, Daniel.
The dangers of dependence.
One more minute. No, I think we're absolutely frozen out. Do you broadly agree with that too, Daniel? That when we do come together.
I totally agree. That's very difficult to create new institutions to make the existing institutions stronger. But I think that is our challenge. And there are still an enormous amount of areas where institutions are run without any democratic control. Think about internet. Do we really know who is really in charge of internet? And I think that we need to open up these global governance institutions to make them more transparent, more accountable, and with a greater amount of participation. Because to think that a certain amount of issues are just, relevant for governments, or the government should be the main players, is really weakening the international system, and it is making even all these sort of relations more, if you like, fragile in front of conflicts. I mean, my heart is today in Kiev, as the heart of many people. I'm thinking, but do we really think that there is an opposition between the citizens of Russia and the citizens of Ukraine? Why this is addressed as an interstate conflict? And the same applies to all possible levels. So I think that one of the major challenges for the global governance of the 21st century is to increase the participation into the already existing and even new international organizations.
Great. Well, I'm very sorry that we lost Pasi to the internet problems, but I think we are arriving at an extremely welcome view, at least on at least one set of issues. That the existing institutions have to be used. They're not going to be the whole of the scene, but they have to be improved. They have to become. We have to try to get through them, and through other means, greater equity, as well as you put it, Daniele, greater transparency and accountability. And all three of you seem to be agreed that this is not a hopeless case, even though it's fraught with difficulties in some, indeed many areas. Well, listen, it was a fascinating discussion. I'm sorry that we were plagued by the difficulties of the internet, but I think we made a lot of progress, and it'll be very interesting indeed to read the transcripts and reflect on everything that come out during the session. I found it enormously educative, and thank you. I think Pasi is now completely dropped off, so I can't thank him, but I thank you, Susan, and thank you, Daniele, very much indeed for participating, and we look forward to further conversations about this over time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ciao.